You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Yeah, the microphone's there. It should be good. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, see, we're picking up.
Good. Okay.
Well, here, you speak.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah, I just want to see your voice bounce on the green.
Jay, is it bouncing? Oh, I see it up there on the top, yeah.
Yeah, see, there we go. We're good.
Okay.
Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to a special episode of Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. We're doing this live from New York with both hosts in the same room. Hi Dad, how are you?
I'm good, Jay. It's good to be here.
Yeah, this was a little bit of a surprise trip. You're coming and staying with us for a few days, so we're going to be able to get some live episodes. Tonight we are doing The Bonding, which is Star Trek The Next Generation Season 3, Episode 5, which debuted on October 23rd, 1989, with a star date of 43196.7. This is, I think this is a really great episode. And it's one of those I kind of always forget when I'm going through, just watching the show on a regular basis. Like, every time it comes on, I kind of just forget the general premise, and I'm always surprised how much I enjoy it. I'm kind of watching it again. The Bonding deals with a lot of very difficult themes. Sudden death, how we deal with it from the perspective of taking care of orphans who lose parents in the line of duty. I think that's very important now, especially in 2021. It also just kind of deals with the fallout of long-term war. And before we get started, I just want to ask, what were your thoughts on the episode?
I thought, one of the comments if I wrote up my notes, I thought about what we're starting to see as we're still early into season 3, but handwritten note I made is that the stories are taking place in a science fiction setting. However, they're becoming more about specific issues and the interactions between the characters.
Right.
And it kind of fits in with recent, I guess it was a YouTube program that you sent me that Bill Shatner had put together. He was the director and the producer, just about how not so much on Next Generation, but with it was
about how the first 3 seasons of Next Generation came together,
and it was a lot about Gene Roddenberry and how his vision and how his vision matured, and how we've talked before about drug problems he had and his health going downhill.
I think it was a fair and critical look. I think it didn't. I didn't think it bashed him too hard, but I also think it didn't take away any of the warts, so to speak.
No, and it just sort of reinforced the conversations we've had about how, this program talked about how there were a lot of sudden changes in the writing crew and so forth, but in terms of how the stories started to get better, in the season 3 with, I guess it was Rick Berman was the key person.
Yeah.
That was, I think we're really seeing
Rick Berman and Michael Pilar.
Yes. Right.
But there had already been really important writers there, like David Gerald and Melinda Snodgrass.
Hurley, that guy.
Yeah. Maury Hurley, as we saw, he's the one who famously got rid of Beverly Crusher.
Right.
In some ways, we're kind of dovetailing away from the episode, but it's a good conversation to have. My interpretation of the documentary and my interpretation of what I've researched about Maurice Hurley, or Maury as he was called, my understanding of Hurley is that he was sent in there to exact Gene's vision of what Star Trek was supposed to be in terms of the content. And it's very interesting how Rick Berman, who also feels in Rick's mind, at least from the interviews I've seen with him, that he's also trying to continue Gene's vision. In many ways, the passing of the show-running torch from Maury Hurley to Rick Berman is interesting because both of them have this feeling and this outlook that they're continuing the great bird in the galaxy's vision of what the future is supposed to be. Gene has this idea that there's not supposed to be like any interpersonal conflicts in the future,
Right.
which, the writers early on complained that, like, well, that leaves us with very little to do, even though I think it was interesting. Brandon Braga, I think he had a really important point where it's like, on one hand, like, yeah, it takes a lot of our tools away, but on the other hand, it made me learn to write in different ways. And I think a lot of those early seasons, especially season 1 and season 2 of Next Gen, there really is kind of there was both the Alien of the Week and the Mystery of the Week format, but there was also an attempt, I think, to be more philosophical than the original series. Because the original series, like, tries to make points, but it really is like the Mystery of the Week or the Alien of the Week versus TNG, which I think has a little bit more of a philosophical weight to it. And I think it's just interesting seeing the interplay between Hurley and Berman, and both of them thinking that they're keeping the Gene's vision. Because, we're really starting to see Rick Berman's vision come into play here. I think he is the executive producer of this episode. And then the next one, Booby Trap, which we'll do later tomorrow, I think Gene produced that one. So Booby Trap is going to be interesting because that's one of the later ones that Gene produces right before, he ultimately passes or leaves the show. I thought the interesting thing about this episode is that we really don't have a lot to talk about in terms of, like, world building or really character building. The interesting thing about the writing is that the characters are already there. We know who Jean-Luc Picard is. We know who Data is. We know who Beverly Crusher is. We already know their stories. We're actually going to start using their stories in this episode to tell something greater.
And I think that, when you asked me, what did I think the main theme was, is that, it really, the main theme was teaching us and getting us to think about how we deal with loss and death.
Right. Well, let's get into it.
Sure.
I have you right here, Memory Alpha. So the USS Enterprise D encounters a planet that appears to be uninhabited. Captain Picard sends an away team to investigate, led by Lieutenant Worf. Picard learns from Data that the planet was once inhabited by a race called the Koinonans, and due to a destructive war, every last person on the planet was annihilated. The civilization seems to kill itself off. I actually want to stop and talk about this premise for a second. We've seen throughout Star Trek, in multiple episodes, both in the original series and in TNG, but also I think later on in DS9 and Voyager, they run into planets and civilizations a lot that have wiped themselves out from war. And I think that that's a very interesting theme that the show keeps hitting back on. We talked about the Drake equation, many times in the previous episodes, that one of the things that kind of stops us from meeting aliens, or the reason we haven't directly met aliens yet, is because there's a high probability that alien civilizations often don't get off their own planet because of things like war or environmental disaster. Actually being a spacefaring race requires you to not only adapt and advance a lot of things, including technology in your own civilization, but you also have to survive the things that happen on the planet and the things that you do to your planet. The Koinonans, I think, are one of many cautionary tales that I think Star Trek is trying to tell us about the potential cost of war. I just wanted to see if you had any comments on that while we touch on it.
I mean, that's a good point to bring up because, again, this is in 1989, and it's just before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union. So, things were changing.
Did the Berlin Wall fall in 89 or 90?
I don't know I thought it was 89, but
Yeah.
I might be wrong about that. But, regardless of the date, once Brezhnev fell out of power, and then there was, Chernenko for a while, the former KGB guy, and then Gorbachev came to power with Glasnost and Perestroika and all of that, where, he wanted to, de-escalate things with the West, particularly the United States. We were moving at this point toward trying to get out of the whole concept of mutual assured destruction and,
Right.
having the constant fear of nuclear annihilation and so forth. And maybe what this episode or this theme that keeps coming up, planets destroying themselves, is the message of saying, humans, don't do this. You need to back away from this. And, we were just starting to get there because, it was then in the early 90s after the Soviet Union fell and China hadn't risen very much still, that, we stopped targeting our nukes against Russian cities and vice versa and so on. But here we are in 2021.
Right.
And we're getting almost back to the same thing. Like, I read an article, I don't know the details, but there was some hypersonic missile that Russia tested.
So the Russians are developing a hypersonic missile that apparently it delivers a payload that travels so fast that missile defense technology that's currently available to the U.S. and other NATO powers won't be able to stop it, or will not be able to stop the full spread of the payload.
Right.
So it's basically like, Israel has an Iron Dome that stops rockets from raining upon Israeli territory, basically. What the hypersonic missile does is basically open big holes
Right.
in your quote-unquote defense.
Mm-hmm.
It's, but we also have seen, like, China recently take a lot of aggressive military posturing. We know that China and Russia have both hacked and compromised our cybersecurity here in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
The specter of war, I think, especially after our recent withdrawal from Afghanistan here in 2021, I actually feel like the specter of war looms larger now than it probably did in 1989 because, the Cold War is ending. So for Roddenberry and maybe the writers like Berman, they're talking about, like, this is a society in terms of the 24th century that they got lucky enough that they are now stumbling on planets that could have Earth could have shared in their fate.
And of course, in Star Trek
First Contact
history,
yeah,
the thing is that there was a Third World War in
right,
2040s or something like that.
1999.
1999, is that when it happened? Well, anyway, but Earth, there was enough humans.
No, you're
left.
right. It was 20-something.
There was enough humans left after World War III, which was a nuclear war, that there were scattered populations of humans, and somehow they came together and realized that we can't do this anymore, and they did form some sort of world government and so forth.
Well, only after Zefram Cochrane launched and tested his first warp engine,
right,
which he built using a nuclear missile.
Yeah, that's right.
And he launched from a nuclear missile silo.
Yeah.
Which says something kind of interesting in itself, symbolically.
Mm-hmm.
The tool. One thing that we have to say about space exploration, especially here in the U.S. and in the history of our relationship with Russia, our advancement in space technology for a long time was explicitly tied to competing with other powers, both economically and militarily. The race to get to space was not only a brinksmanship contest, but it was also a show of like who actually had the civilization to change things on a global level. I think one thing that Roddenberry tried to, well, I think the writers of First Contact tried to do, and I think Star Trek writers tried to do, is show that like the technology that was appropriated and created for destruction can quickly be turned into the exact same thing that delivers us to a new age where we don't have to create things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that's interesting, when we talk about the kind of anti-war tone that's being taken here, so as we get into the story, there it is. So as we get into the story, an accident happens to the away team. One of the members, Enterprise archaeologist Lieutenant Marla Astor, is killed by an unexploded mine that detonates in a ceremonial chamber. She is pronounced dead by Dr. Beverly Crusher upon arrival to the ship, which, I have to say, one of the more dramatic scenes and one of the more dramatic openings to the show. Picard and Worf are understandably disturbed by the senseless death, and the captain learns from Counselor Troy that the deceased crew member is survived by her 12-year-old son, Jeremy Astor. The son is now an orphan, as his father died when he was a child. His only relatives are an aunt and uncle living on Earth. So, looking back to the notes, one thing that happens, I think, as we get into this, is there is a shock to the entire crew at this kind of unexpected death of Marla Astor. And to a certain extent, it makes sense because it's tragic and it's unexpected. But at the same time, it's an interesting pivot to focus on as a story, because there's been plenty of times that other crew members have died in previous episodes, and the focus wasn't placed like this one. And I think one of the things that they're focusing on here, of course, is Jeremy Astor, who's played by, I want to get Jeremy Astor because he's a really great...
He does a good job.
Yeah, played by Gabriel Damon.
Mm-hmm.
Gabriel Damon, by the way, folks, does an amazing job. One of the better... before we get into the storyline again, Gabriel Damon and Will Wheaton, Wesley Crusher, both of them turn in really great performances as actors in this episode.
They do, yes.
So after they discover that he is an orphan, there is kind of this immediate shock and, what are we going to do with the boy afterwards? Worf, who has taken full responsibility for command of the away team and the results of it, talks to Troy about initiating the Rushtai with with Jeremy as a way of bonding and making up for the loss of his mother, which Troy kind of warns off of for a little bit because of the emotional nature of what has happened. Riker and Wesley talk about... we then transition to the bridge where Riker and Wesley have to have a conversation about when Captain Picard had to inform Wesley about Jack Crusher's death when Picard was in command of the Stargazer and Jack Crusher served under him. There's a definite character interplay here where on one hand we're looking at Jeremy Astor's story, but we're also looking at Worf's story. And there's two different stories of grief being told here. The immediate story of, I'm... a family member of mine has been taken. But then there's the other story being told of, I'm partially responsible, in my mind, of losing this person on my watch. And now people outside of me have to suffer because of something I feel responsible for, with Worf. What do you think of the Klingon ritual of Rushtai? Of, you lose someone and you feel responsible for it, so you kind of adopt that person or the surviving members of that person's family into your own.
I think that when Worf brought that up, Troy kind of pushed back because she thought it was too soon, and there's 5 stages of grief, dealing with loss of someone, and I think Troy thought that Worf needed to have some additional time and so forth, but then without going into all the details about this other alien presence that was on the planet and started manipulating Jeremy,
Right.
and not a very fair way. I mean, I used a word in my notes that she mind-fucked the boy multiple times.
Oh, yeah.
And, once it was realized what was going on, and, the adults on the Enterprise sort of rescued Jeremy from this alien presence who was trying to do good, but in a sense, but didn't understand the dynamics of human, human psychology and so forth. The end, which was very meaningful to me and satisfying to me, is since Will Wheaton ended up talking about how he had to deal with his father's death, and Worf had to talk to Jeremy about how he had to deal with his parents' death.
Right, because Worf is an orphan too.
So it made, that conversation, that supportive conversation from Wesley and Worf made Jeremy feel like, look, you're not alone in this. Others have been there. We really do have a sense of how you feel because we've experienced it. So that when the Rustoi, whatever the proper Rushdie is done at the very end of the episode between Worf and Jeremy, it really is the right time to do that. In the way it's portrayed, Jeremy finds it very supportive that he, bonds with Worf. Again, the name of the episode, the bonding, and it's a mutual type thing. Worf says we're brothers, and I just love, at one point when they've kind of completing the ceremony, Jeremy looks up at Worf and smiles, even though he has a tear running down his cheek.
Yeah.
And Michael Dorn gives one of the kind of Worf smiles, which
Yeah.
are always difficult. That just shows I'm very proud of you, and I'm glad to be my brother, and we've done this, and we've honored our mothers.
Well, I wanted to ask you about dealing with the suddenness of death, because this very much has, you've dealt throughout your life with losing people suddenly when you didn't expect. Your mother died not too long ago, my grandmother. She died suddenly. I had a cousin, Mom's nephew, who tragically took his life when we weren't expecting it. People die, unfortunately, when we least expect it, and suddenly, and sometimes in terrible fashions or unexpected things. People can be in a car wreck or be in a shooting or have an aneurysm. How have you always perceived sudden death, and how have you had to deal with it in your life? Because we're doing this show for Ben, ultimately. If what would you tell Ben when it came to, like, if you have to deal with suddenly losing someone?
Well, one of the conversation took place between Riker and Data early in the episode was,
Yeah.
Data asked Riker,
Thank you for bringing that up.
does familiarity with the person who's died make a difference in terms of how you feel?
Right.
And Riker's honest and says, yeah, it does, because when it's more personal, when you know the person better, it has more effect on you. It's more personal, and
Yeah.
so on. And Data says, well, shouldn't it be that anybody who dies, that you have the same feeling? And again, Riker explains the dynamics, how that if you're more familiar with the person, it strikes home further.
Right.
And the first relative I had die was my maternal grandmother in 1965, and I was only 13 then. And I can remember my mother being upset with good reason, I was kind of too young to maybe understand the permanentness of death at that time. And the next time I really understood it, and it really struck home when my two paternal grandparents died within 2 weeks of each other in August of 1971. My grandmother had fallen and broken her hip like in February or something of 71, and she had, arteriosclerosis, particularly in her brain and so forth. She didn't have Alzheimer's, but she had arteriosclerotic dementia, and
Oof.
she went to a funeral home, and she didn't know who people were and so forth, and she finally succumbed. And then my grandfather, who they had been married over 50 years, I think he thought that she would come home because he really did love her very much. And after she died, he became very morose and quiet, and he died 2 weeks later. And he really did die of a broken heart in the sense that an autopsy was performed, and it found that he had, in addition to very bad arteriosclerosis everywhere, because he had been a heavy smoker all of his life, he was 79, he had prosthetic cancer all through his abdominal area, and he must have been in great pain. But even with as sick as he was holding out hope that Grandma, his wife, would come home. But as soon as she was gone, 2 weeks later, we were back at the same cemetery in Baltimore, putting him in the ground next to her. So, that's where, if you're familiar with people, it can become, it just becomes a very personal experience. And the last thing I'll say is, as you deal with various relatives that die, you don't get used to it, but you sort of know what to expect, and you know the processes, that you understand, having experienced the process of grief. I think you know that you can get through it, and it's hard, but as you have multiple experience with losing people that you're close to, whether they're related or not, it doesn't get easier, but it gets more manageable, I would say.
Yeah.
Now with and this goes right to Jeremy, is that Jeremy's had to deal with this. He's 12, and it was
Right.
a couple of years before that his father died from an infectious disease of some sort, and so he had a little bit of experience. But here he is on the Enterprise with his mother, and that's his family, because light years away, he's got some aunt and uncle on Earth that he's probably not close to. So once his mother dies from this, his IED going off on this planet, he really is alone.
Well, that gets us into the next topic I wanted to discuss. But before we transition, one thing I wanted to note about the Riker and Data scene, really well shot. The focus on their faces,
Right.
The crisp picture of Will Riker's eyes as he's actually communicating with Data, the emotion on their faces,
Right.
and even the kind of there's a sadness that Jonathan Frakes is able to portray,
Right.
while talking, where Brett Spiner has this kind of precocious look of wonderment
Yes.
about death,
Right.
and Frakes is able to get Riker to show that he's both sad that he's lost Marla Astor, but he's also happy because he gets to watch Data discover another part of his humanity. Cause
Yeah, that's a good point.
the thing about the discussion that they have reveals again how human Data is.
Exactly.
He's able to measure and understand, I don't feel this way about this person, but I felt this way about Tasha. But I've seen other people feeling the way about Tasha about this person, but
Right.
why don't I do that?
Right, exactly.
And he's doing something very human.
Yes, exactly.
And I think it's one of the beautiful things. I think one of the beautiful things about that conversation, it gets to what you said. You have to go through the process of grief, and there's almost a ritual to it in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't do that ritual, Something really does get left out
Well,
of
the ritual can be, it was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that back in the 60s or 70s defined the 5 stages of grief. I
Right.
don't remember exactly what they were right now, but as you say, there is a process there.
Well, this gets into the next topic because, as you say, Jeremy Astor is now alone. Like, his father's dead and his mother's just been lost in line of duty. Picard and Troy get on a turbo lift, and Picard discusses with Troy the downside of having children on a starship. And I want to actually pull some quotes because they're actually pretty good. Okay, here we go. I've always believed that having children on a starship is a very questionable policy. Serving on a starship means accepting certain risks, certain dangers. Did Jeremy Astor make that choice? And Troy responds, death and loss are an integral part of life everywhere. Leaving him on Earth would not have protected him. And Picard says, no, but Earth isn't likely to be ordered to the neutral zone or to repel a Romulan attack. It was my command which sent his mother to her death. She understood her mission and my duty. Will he? This is, I think, a great topic, and I'm glad it doesn't get resolved in this episode because it's here for you and I to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of Picard's position? And let's go through some facts that we've discussed previously on the show. There's 300 officers serving on the Enterprise D in terms of functioning the ship. The entire crew complement is 1,100. So, there's an extra,
800 there.
800 there. There are,
Right.
civilians, specialists, people on board, dignitaries.
Scientists, right.
People who
Family.
people who come in and out. And Picard has always felt like, even though we are supposed to be explorers, this is still somewhat of a military vessel. The presence of these families somehow does away with that. We don't, here in the modern day, we do not put our families on board with officers on an aircraft carrier. Your children don't get to run the submarine
Mm-hmm.
every morning while you go to work.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of his argument here? And what do you think of Troy's response? I just want to get your general opinion. Because on one hand, I think he's right.
I really think Picard's right.
Yeah.
And it's for whatever the evolution in thinking and the change in policy, so that as you get into the 24th century, you have these large galaxy class starships that can accommodate a large crew, including families and so forth. I mean, there's definitely a trade-off there.
Yeah.
And I think Picard is absolutely right.
Well, it's interesting going back to Gene Roddenberry's vision of the future. Gene Roddenberry had this idea that the Federation was the society where people had gotten rid of interpersonal conflict, but he still wrote stories where, the Society of No Interpersonal Conflict got into conflict with the Klingons and the Romulans and the all sorts of different beings throughout the original series.
Mm-hmm.
Just the concept sometimes of the Enterprise D carrying families and this extra 800 personnel on board does seem very strange in terms of the makeup of the show itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a very unnecessary risk. And if you look at other franchises in Star Trek, there are no civilians walking around on the NX-01. There's Makos for a little bit until they get absorbed in the Starfleet.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember there being there's ambassadors and dignitaries and specialists who are on the Enterprise and the Enterprise 1A. 1A.
1701A.
1701A. But there's no. I don't remember there being a lot of families on board. The D is interesting because it's the only one. Even Deep Space Nine doesn't count because they get the Defiant later on, but Jake Sisko isn't on board the Defiant with Ben Sisko as he's going to the Gamma Quadrant, and even in Voyager, they did not take their families with them when they went hunting for the Maquis.
No, that's right.
And even the Intrepid class is not supposed to be a family ship. It's supposed to be somewhat of warship meets exploration vessel.
Well, and then as part of the answer, again, getting back just the writing of the series,
Right.
does it just make it more interesting? Going back to my comment, is that, you know, you've got these stories being written in a science fiction setting in the future on a Star Trek,
Right.
you know,
Well, you
you
need
know,
to
on a starship, but you've got all of these personality mixes and so forth.
Right.
You know, you've got Chief O'Brien gets married, and they have in future episodes they have some things that go on, interesting things that go on. So, you know, by creating this flying small town,
yeah.
it just gives the writers a lot more possibilities.
Right. Well, like I also think to a certain extent, like, it's also a theory of like you need to have a stage. And one
Mhm.
criticism that people have given is that Roddenberry's version of the future is like this very kind of eclectic but soulless aesthetic. But the truth is, like, if you look at 10 Forward, or you look at the bridge, or you look at even engineering, it's a stage where, you know, characters are supposed to do things, and Borg are supposed to show up, and, you know, the Klingons are supposed to go through the glass floor or be beamed onto the bridge. Like, the entire ship itself is designed to be shot for a TV show, where, you know, you could make the argument that the NX-01, we were just watching episodes of Enterprise earlier today, folks. You know, the way the NX-01 is set out, it's not necessarily conducive to shooting bridge scenes. Like, people are in tight. Same thing with, you know, the Deep Space Nine works because it's just a gigantic stage that they're walking through. But even the original series, the bridge is very, you know, stage-like, but engineering is still kind of like this big long room that people, you know, can do alternate things with. The design of the Enterprise itself, from a production standpoint, lends itself to just being a big Shakespearean platform. And I think that's what we get here. Even the rooms are these huge, gigantic things where just big actions take place. So, one thing that we discover is that there are a lot of these IEDs down on the planet, you know, where the Quinonans once lived, and that they were all pulled out of the ground and they were all defused except for this one that accidentally kills Marla Astor. And that this is a hint of an unidentified presence on the planet.
Well, I think what happened is that the mines, these IEDs, may have not been diffused at all. So when the away team goes down and somehow it's set off and Marla Astor is killed, because we come to find that there is some non-corporeal being or beings on the planet that, you know, maybe after that they said, oh, well, if these corporeal organisms are coming down on the planet, we don't want to kill anybody else. Right. So did they actually deactivate them then?
Yes, I think that's the implicit
right
thing that's being said here. That so there's two different Koinonans that we are going to discover.
Yes, right.
So we might as well broach that here.
Sure.
So, at some point while dealing with Jeremy Astor, a energy spike is discovered on the planet that is unidentified, and suddenly an apparition of Marla Astor appears in Jeremy Astor's quarters and basically says, my baby boy, you know, I'm not actually dead, and you're going to come down to the planet with me, and we're going to live together in this wonderful paradise. You know, everyone on board is immediately suspicious, and Captain Picard does everything he can to make sure that Jeremy Astor does not end up on the planet. What we discover is that there were two different sorts of Koinonans on this war-torn, desolate planet. There was the physical Koinonans who fought this war, and then there were these non-corporeal Koinonans who, I think, observed the war from afar and then tried to stop it, but were unable to because of their non-corporeal status.
Right.
And as you noted, they're probably the ones who defused all these IEDs. I find the notion of the energy field and kind of these non-corporeal koinonins and their solution to what happens to Jeremy Astor interesting, because you say here, how traumatic would such an event actually be to a child the moment Marla Astor appears and disappears? I want to read the notes. Jeremy has to accept his mother's death, and the presence interferes with the process. As you noted, this energy koinonin creates a facsimile of Jeremy's home on Earth using a holodeck technology, which exacerbates things worse for the boy and his turbulent feelings. This all disappears once the Enterprise is able to discover a way to disrupt the power from the energy beam that's being sent up from this war-torn planet. The Presence then becomes malevolent towards Jeremy, trying to make sure that they can get him down to the planet at any cost. As you noted, multiple mindfucks for Jeremy. Let's touch on how traumatic this is for a child. Extremely traumatic. And this is something you and I were talking about earlier, and I want to focus on Counselor Troy. As much as Picard plays a role in this, Counselor Troy is really there to be the voice of every other character and kind of the guiding post. I mentioned, I think, a couple episodes, Counselor Troy works very, very hard to, I think, keep everything going in a way that is often unappreciated. Let me see. There's a quote that she says about what she does for what she does and how she views being a counselor. I think she says, if there is a chance, Memory Alpha doesn't have it at the moment, but basically, if there is a chance that she can take someone's pain and lead them back to joy, that is the joy that she gets from her job as a psychologist and counselor aboard the ship.
Right.
I think that that's a very interesting viewpoint in some ways, because psychologically you have to define what healing is and what the end goal is. And for her, ending pain is bringing someone back to joy. What do you think of that viewpoint that she has in terms of her role as a counselor? And do you think that that is what therapy is in your mind? Bringing someone back to joy. And to her, it sounds... I could construe what she says as joy is this kind of ever-present state.
I think it's the only word that comes to mind. I remember her saying that, and I think it's really utopian, because I think that on a practical basis, if you look at therapy as it exists now, and therapy that therapists that you've had and I've had and others we know have had, it's not a matter of getting them back to joy. It's a matter of helping someone understand why they're depressed, why they're not feeling good about themselves, why they're not able to get along with other people, why they put themselves in bad situations. So it really is, I think what you just said is, therapy helps people cope with uncomfortable situations or problematic situations that they find them in. And if you can get the person where they're happy or joyful, great. But I don't think it happens that often. I think the therapist gets people back where they can be functional.
Right. Well, it's funny that you use the word utopian. Part of me wondered if this is because, she being half betazoid and being empathic, she has to feel everyone's emotions at a constant state. Mm-hmm. So even if you get someone functional, you could be angry and functional still, and you can be depressed and functional, and anxious and functional.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe for her, the goal of moving people back to joy is, in a way, a survival mechanism for her, too. Because if everyone feels joy around her, does she have to feel negative emotions? Mm-hmm. I have to wonder if she is walking around all day just sponging up everyone's psychic energy and just having to deal with the fallout of that. Especially when something like this happens. Mm-hmm. So one thing that this energy being is able to do is recreate Marla and Jimmy Astor's home on Earth, first down on the planet, and then immediately within the quarters. Because it seems like there is, I had a confusion where, okay, it's very clear that they go down to the planet at one point, and then they bring Jeremy back up.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like, the energy gets malevolent and shows up and then takes him back. But then the energy's unable to take Marla Astor's manifest form through the force fields that they use to section her and Jeremy off from escaping. So she immediately takes the boy back into the quarters, and when Captain Picard and Troy enter, it's the Earth home of Marla and Jeremy Astor again.
Mm-hmm.
Which means, like, she didn't really have... This energy didn't actually have to transport them down. It seems like they could just transpose their position.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, they have transporter tech... This being already has some sort of transporter technology.
Transporter and holodeck, yeah.
And some sort of holographic projection.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think the... I think the thing that made me really interested in the non-physical Koinonans is that this entire jaunt that they're doing to save Jeremy Astor and bring him down to the planet is to make sure that the pain that they witnessed from the death of the physical Koinonans was not allowed to repeat itself. They no longer want any victims of the war, to the point where they're going to set up this child for the rest of his life to basically live in the Garden of Eden or bliss.
Yeah, the entity, as Marla Astor says, it is our duty to make him happy again. And I made the positive, well, why? And is it that the non-corporeal being or beings on the planet saw what the corporeal beings did to one another, how they annihilated each other? And if they couldn't stop it, or obviously they couldn't stop it, but we don't know if they could, and they failed, is by trying to keep Jeremy, this duty to make him happy. Is it like penance in some way?
I think it's both penance. I also think it's trying to cover up the fact of what happened, because I think when you do something so awful, and it's interesting we're talking about this because a few weeks ago they arrested a really old German man in South America.
Right.
I think you heard about this.
Yeah, it was like 90-something.
Yeah, but he's on trial now for
Yeah.
Nazi war crimes. He was
Right.
at the death camps.
Right.
He knew. Like, they've talked to him now, and they're like, what... One of the things he's apparently said is that he's glad that he's been caught because he was walking around with this guilt. I have a theory, and this is just a theory. These non-physical Koinonans can actually take physical form. Marla Astor can, like, touch Jeremy and move things, and, like, they can manifest physical things. I don't necessarily buy this entire story that the non-physical Koinonans just sat back and watched the physical Koinonans destroy themselves. Like, you already have the power to manifest physical things. Why didn't you stop them?
Well, because if what we're saying is, what we're taking from the story is that the mines, the IEDs, were left over from the war, however hundreds or thousands of years it took place in the past, and if they were disarmed after the Marla Astor was killed, then that's
before Marla Astor was killed. Yeah,
that the non-corporeal Koinonans had the ability to affect what the corporeal beings were doing.
The point I'm getting to, and yes, I actually believe that the non-corporeal Koinonans took part or paid or are complicit in some way with the death of the corporeal Koinonans, and that the death of Marla Astor is not only a tragedy to them because it's a continuance of a war that they have not wanted to see repeated for hundreds of thousands of years, but it's a potential uncovering of their sins down there on that planet. They don't want Jeremy to suffer because it's going to remind them of what they did. Because, they don't have to make themselves known. Like, if anything, they could have just let the crew of the Enterprise go on. Like, this is a tragedy, this is awful. The best thing that we can do is leave these people alone.
And that addresses my comment or question as to why did they do this?
Well, I think there is a need to see people who are harmed. And this is where I'm going to say something nice about these non-corporeal Koinonians. I think if you see enough terrible shit in your life, you get to the point where you want to see people who are suffering not suffer anymore, or be healed. And I think these Koinonians have suffered enough seeing the physical Koinonians die that the very thought of Jeremy Astor suffering is intolerable to them. So they actually do want this boy to heal. Now, it may be for self-interested reasons, but they do want him to, they do want to try to make this right by him. So there is some honorable sense to all this. The reason why I think this fails so tragically for them, and I wanted to get your viewpoint on this, and this kind of gets back to the conversation of death and, the familiarity of it. The trauma initially for Jeremy Astor, and I think for all of us when we deal with death, is the person's there one moment, and then they're not. And what mindfucks him in this episode is that Marla Astor's spirit, or Marla Astor's corpse, keeps popping up and telling him, I love you, let's go home. I love you, let's go home. The non-corporeal Koinonians don't understand the trauma of losing the physical presence of someone and having it reappear. So they have no idea how mind-fucking this is for the small boy, because they don't have physical corporeal sense, or they don't value it the same way we do.
Well, the question, and perhaps the question is, and the assumption can be made that the non-corporeal Koinonians may not be mortal themselves.
Yes.
So that, and they don't, and this gets back to one of the main points of discussion as we've discussed, that this episode is about how we as humans deal with loss and death.
Right.
And we just talked about how the entity is trying for, probably a good reason. Well, a good reason, even though if it's perhaps out of guilt and some penance, they want to make sure Jeremy doesn't suffer. Once they don't understand how the process works in humans, but when Picard and Wesley has the conversation about how Wesley felt about Picard telling him about his father's death, there's actually a catharsis for Wesley finally telling Picard how he felt, and that he was angry at Picard, but he's not anymore. Which gets into the aspect of, the idea of time heals all wounds, or time heals wounds. Time can heal wounds. And then when Worf throws his 2 cents in about the loss of his parents, then the non-corporeal entity realizes that, okay, I'm getting a better understanding of how these humans work and how they're going to treat Jeremy, and they're actually going to take care of him, and they can take care of him better than I probably can take care of them, because as Picard points out, and Troy, he says, and Troy, look, if you take him down to the planet, you're going to create some, holographic home for him and so forth, but, where are real other humans going to be? Is he going to have friends? Is he going to have a wife? Is he going to have children? Would he actually have a real life?
What happens when he grows old?
And the non-corporeal entity realizes that, you know what, they're probably right. I need to just back off, particularly since I better understand what the process is of humans dealing with grief, and that these people that Jeremy's with on this ship are truly loving and caring about him. They may not be able to make him happy right away, but they're going to help him through the process.
One thing that just popped in my head, and I think that we've covered this episode very well, and this, I was going to end the episode here because
Sure.
I thought you ended it on a very good note. But one thing that popped into my head was the previous episode we just did about the issue of First Contact. And maybe that, Beverly Crusher rescues Liko from Mintaka from the surface of Mintaka 3 because
Right.
he breaks his back after he falls from the duck blind.
Right.
Picard makes the argument that you should have let him die down there, and something that we discussed is a very strange character trait for Picard, it seems. But on the other hand, here, the Koinonians don't have any idea of a prime directive, so the entire idea of walking into someone else's culture and interfering this way is not seen as foreign to them. So it really does make me wonder, what is the nature of these non-corporeal entities in Star Trek? Because it always seems that there is an intentionality that the writers place behind them. Even Q, if he's supposed to be a stand-in for God, which, was one of the things covered in that documentary that I found very interesting, because John Delancey's a diehard atheist and rationalist. A lot of people don't know that. It wasn't really covered in the documentary.
No.
But, at the same time, Roddenberry was... I won't say that he was an atheist, because he definitely had some spiritual leanings, but he was an anti-theist, if there is a term for that. It always seems that these non-corporeal entities that have somewhat of these omnipotent powers, being able to create things out of nothing, they always have this intentionality of doing something specific, whether it's healing humans or testing humans, but there's always a sense that it's okay to interfere. What do you think that says about the writers, or maybe Star Trek's viewpoint of the spirit, or ghosts, or maybe just the idea of the supernatural or the paranormal? Because in any other story, let's say if you take this and set it in the 1800s or set it in the 1900s, this is a ghost story. What do you think that what the show set presents about non-corporeal, dealing with non-corporeal beings?
I guess what it's suggesting, of course this is my projection onto it, it's sort of that these, we've seen many cases where these non-corporeal entities exist, and sometimes they're just a field of energy or a ball of energy and so on. And it gets into what you brought up, just about if you took someone from this 18th century or 17th century and brought them here now, they would think a lot of the things we do every day as magic.
Yeah.
Because, we said if you use science to advance technology and so forth, that if you don't understand the science, you think it's witchcraft.
Right.
You think it's magic. And, when we talk about, like in Who Watches the Watchers, and talking about, ghosts and spirits and things like that come up, and we've talked about this a little, like, it's kind of like UFOs.
Yeah.
There's something there, for sure. The U.S. government, if you can trust them for anything these days, little side comment.
Yeah.
There's something there, but we don't know what it is. There's plenty of, documentation of encounters with, human spirits.
Yeah.
And it's something we don't understand. And there probably, if they truly do exist, there's some physical reason for their existence, but our science hasn't caught up. Thus, it's magic or it's
Yeah.
witchcraft like stuff.
Well, I find it interesting that the show takes such a. The story about this is that Marlo, the non-corporeal Quinonan, realizes that it's through the community that these humans already have that this boy is going to be okay, versus having to rely on some sort of supernatural entity to solve the problem.
Oh, that's a good point.
Or bring your mom back from the dead.
Right.
Instead of relying on the paranormal and magic to solve your issue, you have to rely on the humans around you and your own innate humanity to get through. As you said, like earlier, when it comes to dealing with sudden death, you have to go through the process. And if anything, I think Star Trek may be asserting that like relying on paranormal or supernatural entities in the process is actually an inhibitance to it. And I was just wondering, do you think having a sense of faith or supernatural or reliance on the supernatural or the paranormal in dealing with death is actually a hindrance to the process? And we'll end it here because I think this is a good place and we've hit on something good.
No, I don't think it's a bad thing because I remember when my father died and it was my mother and my wife, your mother, went to the hospital. My father died at 11:30 at night on a Friday night, and there was a Baptist minister there, a chaplain, and he was very helpful, just saying, look, your father was a Christian and he believed through Jesus he would have eternal life, and if you believe in what he believed in, then he's with others that have passed on before him. And it was a very comforting thought at that time.
Yeah.
And and again, there's no proof of that. Belief in God, belief in Jesus, belief in any religious tradition is you can't prove it. It's based on faith.
Well, I think one thing that I have to criticize this episode and maybe criticize Roddenberry for, one thing that I get from Roddenberry is my sense of humanism. Like, me and
for sure.
Roddenberry and I are both humanists.
Yes.
But I think one thing that I've often criticized about secular humanists, because I don't consider myself a secular humanist.
Right.
I believe there is a spiritual aspect to all of this.
Right, yes.
Now, I do think I am a secularist in terms of like how we should legislate and how we should determine policy. I don't think the supernatural and paranormal have any right to a woman's uterus as they do to my vote or what power does in the halls of government. God should not be in government. That said, however, I think that the supernatural and paranormal, or the religious or the spiritual, if put in the right context and presented in the right way, as you presented just recently with your example of the Baptist minister after Granddaddy died, I think that can be extremely healing and helpful and actually help people get down to processing their grief in an appropriate way. I think that sometimes Star Trek takes such a negative approach to the idea of spirituality that when they do have pro-spirituality episodes, which they will, it kind of defeats the messages of episodes like this. Because on one hand, they say don't do the spiritual don't rely on these supernatural spiritual things. But the very last scene is Jeremy Astor and Worf taking part in a religious ceremony.
Which actually is a religious ceremony.
It is.
Yes.
So, I think there's a very kind of mixed message that gets sent here.
I would agree. Yeah.
So maybe the more that we look into this, the more the show will be revealing.
Right.
In terms of how they deal with that. Well, Dad, thank you so much for joining me.
Sure. Tonight,
this is, of course, a live episode, so we're very, very lucky to have you. The next time we do this, which will be very, very soon, we will be discussing The Booby Trap, which is Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 3, Episode 6. We'll see you all then.
Very good. Thanks, Jay.